Well, hello, friends. Welcome back to Commute Talk. It is gray and rainy here, which I actually kind of like after these extremely hot days. Anyways, so today I thought I would not take a viewer question, but instead talk about something of my own. Um, I've been thinking about English as a programming language lately, and um, how it's become so important to me to uh, to write code that reads well as English, and I didn't used to do that. Like when I started out programming, I learned to use single character variable names, as you do, and there was the foos and the bars, and eventually you start to add a few characters, and like L becomes len, maybe even length sometimes. But it wasn't until I started working on WebKit really that I got really into programming in like this C++ English hybrid language, um, and it was I guess it was like through code review and interacting with some of the very very senior people in the WebKit project that I sort of absorbed this type of stuff. So what I do now is that I try to write code that reads well as English, and by sort of working together with the language keywords. So there's like the if keyword and the while keyword and so on, right? And I find that if I write code that sort of works with the keywords, then you would have something that says like if window dot is visible, then you can read that out as like if window is visible. And I find that there's just something that happens in the brain when it's not just a programming language unit in my brain that's active, but also like the regular English natural language unit. And it really feels like these two things are able to run in parallel, and it just allows me to understand code so much faster if it's written in this way, especially when it's code coming from other people. And in fact, that's probably why I learned to do it this way, because when I started working on projects that had strict review requirements, then I'm always writing code that someone else is going to read, right? So there was always like a target audience for my code that wasn't necessarily just me, but also like the person who's going to read and approve that code. So it's in my interest to make it as easy as possible for that person to read what I've written. And so that's where I learned this write in English thing. And the English part, like it's mostly about variable names and APIs. To some extent, class names also, and type names, but I find that the class names, they're less important than the API names. Like the APIs and the variable names, they really make or break this methodology. And a common tip that people often have in this area is for enums, that like that if you're taking Boolean parameters to a function, then it makes the call site very unreadable very often, right? Especially if you have many of them. Like if you have just one Boolean argument to something, then often you can kind of get away with it, especially if your editor allows you to sort of get some method definition, whatever, to pop up when you hover the call. But if you have a call that takes like 3 Boolean parameters, that's kind of gross, and like it's insanely confusing. And in fact, you can even see this with APIs that take something like 2 ints. That's already ambiguous at the call site, right? Like I know that like convention is for something like a substring create like a function that creates a substring. You would kind of expect it to have like a start and a length, but it might also be like start and end, or like it could be. You don't know if they're just two ints. You don't know what they represent at the call site, and that's something that I find very unpleasant when writing code. And I would actually like being able to do something like you have in Objective-C where you can name the arguments at the call site. I would love that as an optional feature of C++ for clarification. But anyway, I really do think that using enums instead of booleans is good. I'm lazy about this myself very often because it's tedious to create an enum and to put the effort into coming up with a good name for it. But it is worth doing that. Like, it is worth it. And I have to slap myself into doing it more often because it just makes the call site that much better. Because, like if you have say that you have a painting function that draws draws a frame around something, right? And then you want to specify whether or not that frame has a shadow, say. Then you can have an API called like paint frame, and then it takes a rect and a color and a boolean for like has shadow. But if you have an enum instead, it's called like it should paint shadow, for instance, and then you would have two values like yes and no. Then calling like paint frame rect color should paint shadow : yes. Like that's so much more obvious what's going on and what's being told to this API. Anyways, I don't know why I started talking about that. It's totally part of this subject, right? Like writing code that makes the call sites extremely explicit what's going on. And I also like if some condition is complex and it becomes hard to see what like a condition is about. Like if some condition is like, if this paren block or this paren block and this paren block, like that type of stuff, I find it very, very useful to put that into a temporary Boolean variable and giving it like an explicit name of what is like the high-level description of the condition that you're testing for here. And then say that you're in the Windows server, for instance, and you're testing like if a window is if this window has a dirty rect within the visible part of the screen, then instead of like having an if statement that tests all the different coordinates, like if this rect contains that rect and that rect contains this rect, and like one entry in this list of rects matches your dirty rect, then you would just make a temporary variable that's called like has dirty rect in visible screen region or something like that, or screen rect, and then you can write out like if window has dirty rect in la 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 la. And I just find that writing your code in this way, it just makes it that much easier to understand. And not just when you're reading it, but also while you're writing it, because it sort of forces you to think about what you're really expressing. Because you're probably familiar with this thing where you're writing out some like logic or some condition stuff, and you get it wrong, and then you just sort of know from trial and error, from years of trial and error, that, I'll just reverse the conditions, and maybe it just starts working. And very often it does, but then you sort of did that by, out of habit, instead of doing it because you knew what you were changing. And I find that when you do that, like if you're doing that as part of like creating a temporary variable that expresses something, then it's often much, much clearer what you're doing wrong, because like right next to the condition is a variable name containing a very high level, or like a high level definition of what the condition is about, or a high level explanation. So I think that's tremendously useful. Um, and then I guess another benefit to writing in English is, and it's really more like a benefit of writing very consistently. But if you like come up with a scheme or like convention for the way you name things, and then you're very consistent about it, then as you get more and more experience writing in the style that you like, then it sort of becomes second nature, and you can even start to guess what your APIs are, even if you haven't touched them for like a long time. You still sort of know what they would be if you were to write them right now. And at least that happens for me very often. Like I implement some API like months ago, and I forget how it works, and then I try to use it, and I just start trying to type like what would be the logical name of this functionality, and very often I just get a hit, and then the code completion thing in the IDE fills in the rest. But like I find that really nice that I'm able to guess what I've done in the past, and it's very often accurate because of the consistency. But yeah, I really, really, really think that writing in English is so much better than writing out these like typical cryptic names or short names. Because like, if you're trying to save characters, why? Like you try to type less. If you use like an editor that knows how to autocomplete and knows how to do like code API, what's it called? Suggestions, autocompletion, code completion, that type of stuff. Then it shouldn't be a concern that you have to type more if your variable names are longer, because you would just autocomplete them. And maybe it's a screen space thing, but like, who's really constrained by screen space today? Like, I don't know. I guess I can understand if it's like some personal aesthetics thing, but there's just such huge benefits to giving your brain that much extra clue into what you're doing. Because this is all about your brain, right? Like, this doesn't help the compiler in the slightest, but it helps you. And it's important to help the compiler, but it's also really important to help yourself and help the other people who read the code. I guess, I guess those are just some thoughts about that. Just something I've been thinking about lately. Yeah. I suddenly ran out of steam. But I don't know. What do you think? Like, do you use short variable names, long variable names? If so, why? If not so, why? Why? Let's talk about it. I really think that there's a strong benefit to taking advantage of your brain's ability to do like instruction pipelining with all the different language centers at the same time. But yeah. So, anyways, I have to stop talking. So thanks for hanging out with me on the commute, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.